Welcome to the genealogy of the Western Australian G class. I could have called this the genealogy of the South Australian Y class, or the Tasmanian C class, or the genealogy of the Beyer Peacock colonial mogul. But I decided to call it genealogy of the Western Australian G class because they were the most widely used locomotives on Australian timber and firewood lines, although they were almost all confined to Western Australia. Since the LRRSA is not involved with mainline railways, it seemed most appropriate to choose the Western Australian G class for the title. The reason they weren't used on timber tramways outside Western Australia was because the Western Australian timber companies were generally much larger affairs than those in the eastern states. And the eastern states didn't need such large locomotives. The G class was the fourth generation of a very successful Beyer Peacock design. And these four generations are my interpretation of the development of the design. Others might have different interpretations. And in this presentation, I'll refer to the family from time to time. By the family, I mean locomotives in all four generations of the type. That's an example of a Western Australian G class on a firewood line in the early 1970s. And that's one of the 460 variants, which we'll mention later. The G class were very widely used throughout Australia, except in Victoria, and very few in Queensland and New South Wales. They were widely used in the southern states that had 3-foot 6-inch gauge. They were used on all parts of the Western Australian Government Railways. There's a Western Australian Government Railways example which I photographed in 1966. It's looking a bit forlorn there, but it shows a typical WAGR smokebox door, chopper coupling, and vacuum brakes, which were typical of WAGR at that time. And each of the different state railways that used the type had variations in terms of couplings and brakes. There's a South Australian example photographed in 1967. That's the YX class, which was the Y class rebuilt with a larger boiler. It has the chopper coupling and Westinghouse brakes this time. And note the enormous dome, which I think was to help cope with the very poor water quality in South Australia. In Tasmania, the type was widely used as the C class, and some were rebuilt as the CC class, as shown here in Hobart. CC class had a larger boiler with Belpaire firebox. And as with all Tasmanian Railways locomotives, they had double buffers and screw couplings and vacuum brakes. The type was used as the first standard mainline locomotives on the Silverton Tramway, which connected Broken Hill in New South Wales with the South Australian Railways at Coburn. The top picture shows an early Silverton example with sloping smokebox front, single bogie six-wheel tender, whereas the lower picture shows a later example with a straight smokebox front, a bell pair firebox, and a more conventional six-wheel tender. The Emu Bay Railway Company in Tasmania had only one example shown here with a straight smokebox front and a stovepipe chimney similar to those used by the Tasmanian Government Railways, and it was compatible with the T&BR with both double buffers and vacuum brakes. And the type was widely used throughout remote parts of Australia on private railways and industrial railways. For example, the Western Australian Manganese Company, the Port Hedland Marble Bar Railway in northwest Western Australia, the Darwin-Laramar Railway in the Northern Territory, where they were the heaviest locomotives that could operate on that line, and the Chillago Mining and Railway Company in far north Queensland was the only user of the type in Queensland. They had 5 examples. 2 of them are shown here, and their 5 examples, 2 were purchased new and 3 were purchased second hand. They weren't widely used outside Australia except in South America, but variants of the type, which we'll look at towards the end of this presentation, were more widely used. But of the 260, they were used in Colombia on the Barranquilla Railway and Pier Company, EF Minas and Rio Railway in Brazil, and the Chubut Central Railway in Argentina, and there may have been others. All of those were metre gauge. Notice on this Argentinian example, the slide bars are protected. Presumably it ran through sandy desert-like country. Now I'll come to what I see as the defining characteristics of the whole family. The cylinders were always outside, irrespective of the gauge. And the gauge could be anywhere between 3 feet and 5 feet 6. The cylinders were always sloping, and there was always a leading Bissell track or Bissell bogie under the cylinders. Beyer Peacock pioneered this type. Other builders followed. Now the Bissell track was invented in 1857 by Levi Bissell of New York. And Beyer Peacock was one of the first users of that type of track in Britain. A top view of the Bissell track is shown here. there was a sort of triangular frame with the axle there and a pivot here, so that the whole frame with the axle could swing around curves. And a front view of the Bissell truck is shown here, where there is a pivot here directly above the axle, and that takes the weight of the locomotive at that point, allowing the axle to move up and down around that pivot according to undulations in the track. And there is always some sort of springing arrangement or other control mechanism to keep that up and down movement in control. There are also four-wheel Bissell bogies, in which case the frame would be extended, there'd be a second axle, and the weight point and pivot would be between the two axles. Now we come to a bit of ancient railway history with Stephenson's Planet of 1830, which was a design of locomotive that followed the Rocket of 1829. And the Rocket had steeply sloping outside cylinders. And those steeply sloping outside cylinders caused the locomotive to hunt sideways with every revolution of the wheels and to rock up and down with every revolution of the wheels. The Planet was a great improvement. It had the cylinders inside the frames and horizontal to the driving axle. And the driving axle was cranked, which we'll come to shortly. With this arrangement, there was no tendency for the locomotive to rock up and down with every revolution of the wheels, and no tendency for it to hunt from side to side with every revolution of the wheels. This tendency to rock up and down and hunt from side to side with outside cylinders was a major problem in 1830. Locomotive builders later learned how to control it by the more careful placement of the cylinders and use of balance weights. But nevertheless, this design with inside cylinders became the standard for British railway locomotives in the 19th century and for many of their exports. And there's an Australian example in the about 1880, the Dunilla and Moama Railway Company of New South Wales, 5-foot 3-inch gauge 060 tender locomotive with the cylinders under the smoke box. And yes, there were 5-foot 3-inch gauge railways in New South Wales, just a few across the Victorian border. But the big disadvantage of inside cylinder locomotives was the need for a crank driving axle. And we can see a crank driving axle here. There are two cranks, one there and another one at 90 degrees to that one here. So that's an end-on view, that's a front-on view of the crank. These were difficult to make, especially with the technology of the 1830s and the 1840s, and they tended to break. And a broken driving axle on a train running at speed was not something to be taken lightly. As a result of this, a number of locomotive builders and railways still favoured outside cylinders. One such was the Grand Junction Railway in England, as they'd had a number of problems with broken crank axles. So they developed the Crewe type locomotive as shown in this picture, which has outside cylinders above the leading non-powered axle and two driving axles. That has most of the attributes of the first generation of the type, which we'll see shortly, except no leading Bissell truck. That axle could not swing, and no compensation between the two driving axles. One of the works manager at Crewe was at one time Thomas Hunt, and he became very familiar with this type of design, and he later became the locomotive superintendent of the Tudela and Bilbao Railway in Spain, which we will come to very shortly. One of the reasons why these locomotives were successful in England is because they could afford to have very well-maintained track with curves of very gentle radius, so they didn't need to have a flexible wheelbase. So we come to the first generation, which dated from 1861 on the Tudela and Bilbao Railway in Spain. This was a Spanish company, but they used English contractors and expertise in the construction. Thomas Hunt was their locomotive superintendent. Thomas Hunt had previously worked at the Crewe works, so he was familiar with the Crewe type of locomotive, and he favoured outside cylinders. The T&BR was 230 kilometres long, of 5 foot 5 3/4 inch gauge, and it ran through difficult country, crossing the Cantabrian Pyrenees. That's a map of the northern part of the half of the line, and as you can see, it was very windy, which indicates mountainous territory, a difficult railway to operate. Hunt worked with Herman Ludwig Lange of Beyer Peacock to come up with a modified Crewe type locomotive with a leading Bissell truck and compensating beams here. So this had 3-point suspension. One point was that pivot there. The second point was the pivot on the opposite side. And the third point was the pivot on the centre of that leading axle. So with 3-point suspension, it spread the weight over undulating track, and that was good for both the locomotive and for the track. 41 of these locomotives were built in 1862 and 1863. They were very successful, and the last was withdrawn in 1933. And if you're familiar with the Isle of Man Railway 248 tanks, you'll note the similar profile. For the same railway, they built 8 440 tank versions with a leading Bissell bogie. Most dimensions were the same as the 240. All of these were also very successful. One of them survives at Abando Station, Bilbao. That picture was taken some years ago. I gather it's been cleaned up and repainted since then. Now, two John Fowlers enter this story, and they're not related. The first one is Sir John Fowler, who was a well-known railway contractor involved in major railway projects in the United Kingdom and overseas. I'm going to refer to him as Sir John Fowler. The second John Fowler was the owner of an engineering works building agricultural machinery and railway locomotives. He was the same John Fowler who was well known for traction engines and well known for supplying locomotives to the Queensland sugar tramways. I will refer to him as John Fowler and Company, which was the trading name. Sir John Fowler was a customer of John Fowler and Company when Beyer Peacock was fully occupied. I get the impression that Sir John Fowler preferred Beyer Peacock as the locomotive builder, but was happy to go to John Fowler and Company when Beyer Peacock was too busy. And Sir John Fowler brought Beyer Peacock a lot of business. We then come to the very well-known Metropolitan Railway, the Metropolitan tanks. Sir John Fowler was the engineer for the standard gauge Metropolitan Railway in London. He asked Beyer Peacock for 6 locomotives, and he needed them for quick delivery. So Beyer Peacock offered the T&BR type 440 tank adapted to standard gauge. The Metropolitan Railway was 13 miles long. It had 27 stations. Almost all was curved track. There were many sharp curves, and many of those curves were so sharp they had check rails. So it was a difficult railway to operate, and it wasn't a high-speed operation. These locomotives were so successful in that role that by 1895 there were 54 in use. But they weren't so useful, not so successful in secondary mainline service. The London and South Western Railway in England had 6 of them, but they found they were unstable at high speed, meaning about 50 miles an hour. They needed modifications to the bogies to work at that speed. So I think we're getting a picture that these locomotives were good on winding track and difficult track, but not so good on, or not so useful on well-engineered, easy graded, easy curved track. Here's another one of the Metropolitan tanks in service. These had this pipe running there to the water tanks to divert the steam when the locos were running underground, because they weren't allowed to eject any steam when they were in tunnels. And much of that railway was in tunnel. I think it was the first underground metropolitan railway in the world. And working such a railway with steam was something of a problem. The railway crossing the Blue Mountains in New South Wales was also very winding and steep and curvy and had 2 zigzags. And the New South Wales Government Railways went to Beyer Peacock for suitable locomotives. And they supplied a standard gauge version of the T&BR 240, shown here. It was the New South Wales G23 class. There were 13. They impressed the New South Wales Government Railways greatly. New South Wales Government Railways became Beyer Peacock's biggest customer for all sorts of different locomotives. And there's a G23 class in service in New South Wales. In 1879, the NSWGR obtained an enlarged version of the G23 class, a 440 version, of which a total of 68 were built. They later became the Z12 class of the NSWGR. Now we come to a smaller variant of the T&BR 240. This is a picture of a model in Egypt. It was a standard gauge 240 tank for Egypt, and it was another Sir John Fowler project. I think you can, if you know the Isle of Man railways, I think you'll see a similarity there in the general style. That's the same type of locomotive. There were 30, and the order was split between Beyer Peacock and John Fowler. Now we come to something of an ugly duckling. And this is the smallest variant I've found of the first generation, a 240 for South Australian 5'3" gauge. I gather these were originally ordered as a replacement for horses on railways intended for horse haulage, but they were quite successful. I think they might have been more successful than they expected, actually. They lasted fairly well. So now we come to the second generation in 1866, and this is where the gauge and size was reduced to 3'6" gauge. And I think this resulted in what was arguably the first really successful 3'6" gauge mainline locomotive. In 1857, a group of 4 Norwegian railway engineers decided to adopt narrow gauge for most Norwegian railways. That was an economy measure. Carl Abraham Peel was the only one with extended railway experience, and that was in England. He decided that gauge would be 3'6". He wanted English locomotives for the railways, but he was very frustrated by the conservatism of English locomotive builders, and he had great difficulty getting them to even consider building for 3'6" gauge. The first locomotives that were built were 4 042 tanks by Robert Stephenson and Company, supplied in 1860. They were very well built and they operated quite well, but they had a rigid wheelbase of 12'9". Robert Stephenson and Company refused to use radial axles or Bissell bogies on 3'6" gauge. In fact, they said to Carl Abraham Peel that 3'6" gauge would not work and you should not go below standard gauge. So Peel went to Avonside. They were a bit more accommodating and they were prepared to try Bissell trucks. And he obtained 2 240 tanks from Avonside, which had a leading Bissell truck behind the cylinders. There were serious quality control issues with these, but once they were overcome, the locos worked reasonably satisfactorily on 9-chain curves. However, they were not outstanding. Incidentally, Queensland's first 4 locomotives were of the same type and built at the same time and of the same dimensions, but they were built as 240 tender locos. They didn't seem to have the same quality control issues, and I think that was because Queensland Railways had a consultant engineer in England closely looking at the quality of them before they were shipped, which was a very good idea because Queensland was so remote from England. If they delivered shoddy quality goods, it was very difficult to get a quick fix. That wasn't the case if they are just going to Norway. And the third attempt was also from Avonside, only one trial locomotive, an 042 back tank, and that had a Adams radial axle. It was one of the first uses of the Adams radial axle that had just been invented. The train crews referred to this as a cart, and that wasn't a compliment. So then Peel sought the help of Charles Beyer of Beyer Peacock, and together they developed a reduced size version of the T&BR 240. The first of them was named Trigvie. It became the first of the Trigvie class, delivered in 1866, was an immediate success. 24 more were built over 16 years, and another 10 by the Swedish firm of Motala. Amongst other things, these worked double-headed on overnight sleeping car trains on the Oslo-Trondheim route. In that service, they had a permanently attached tender. There are many detailed differences in the 24 class members, like better cabs as shown on this one, Thora of 1874. And amongst other things, as the class was delivered over a fairly long period of time, the quantity of steel used in construction as opposed to iron gradually increased. That was due to the reduced cost of steel due to the development of the Bessemer process. At the same time, the locomotives were being delivered. To show how successful these were compared to their predecessors, the Trigvie class were allowed 55 km/h maximum speed in either direction. All their predecessors were only allowed 30 km/h. There were 2 similar metre gauge examples supplied to the Bolivar Railway in Colombia. And 2 came to Australia for the Jarradale, Jarrah and Forest and Railways Limited in Western Australia. The first came in 1882 and was called Samson. And there's an early photograph of Samson in service. And the name of the second one was rather uninspired, Samson No.2. Here's a much later picture of Samson No.2 out of service in 1946. And by this time it had received an extended smoke box. And the most well-known type was the Isle of Man Railway 240 tanks. first of which was built in 1873. And a number are still in use, like Fenella, shown here in 2016. And that one still has its sloping smokebox front. 2 3-foot gauge versions of these were also supplied to the Ballymena and Larne Railway in Ireland. And incidentally, of the whole family, I don't think any was supplied to a gauge less than 3 feet. There are a few variants of the Trig V class, like these reduced sized ones, the Chalva class 240 tank for Norway. These were known, they were about 2/3 of the weight of the Trig V class, and the intent was to use them on very light trains of the type that would later be worked with rail motors and trailers. And in fact, when rail motors went into service in Norway, all of these were taken out of service pretty quickly. Note the inside frame Bissell track on these, which is an instant identifier that they're not a Chalva, they're not a Trig V, they're a Chalva. So they were known as kittens by the crews because they didn't have much reserve of power. They were good for the purpose that they were designed, but they didn't have any extra oomph. One of these has survived, Alf, in the excellent Railway Museum at Hamar in Norway. And a more radical version of the second generation was the D class of Tasmania, 242 tank, 5 of which were built for the Hobart suburban services. Now we go on to the third generation, and the first of them were used on the Sudan Railway. With the third generation, an extra pair of driving wheels were added. And Sir John Fowler enters the picture again. He was the consulting engineer for the Egyptian Government Railways, which included the Sudan Railway. This was built to 3-foot 6-inch gauge at Sir John's recommendation. Having already had good experience with the first generation Metropolitan tanks, and having seen the second generation Trig V class in Norway, travelling at 36 miles per hour with complete steadiness, he thought the design might be suitable for it, or elements of the design might be suitable for a 268 tank for the Sudan Railway. And it inherited the sloping cylinders and the leading Bissell track. And I think William Thow had a place in the design of this because it's got the distinctive circular cab side windows. William Thow will come into the picture shortly. Although this is purely of Beyer Peacock style, these 4 locos were built by John Fowler and Company. Presumably Beyer Peacock were fully committed and agreeable for John Fowler to build them, as had previously been the case with half the order for the Egyptian 240 tanks. Meanwhile, in South Australia, where the 3-foot 6-inch gauge had been inflicted upon them by one parliamentarian who had the balance of power, their first 3-foot 6-inch gauge locomotives were 8260s, like this, the U class, built by Peacock, but not of a Beyer Peacock design. They were designed by JFL Jetta, the South Australian Government's consulting and inspection engineer in London. He'd previously been the first locomotive superintendent of the Queensland Railways, and he designed their first 260 locomotives. So this design is based on those early Queensland 260 locomotives. As such, they were the first 260s and used on any 3-foot 6-inch gauge main line in the world. I'm talking about the Queensland ones. They were pioneering 6-coupled locomotives on 3-foot 6-inch gauge railways. This design had its problems. The Bissell truck was behind the cylinders. That caused maintenance problems. And in terms of tracking ability, they were nowhere near as good as their successors, W class, which we'll now come to shortly. So we're introducing William Thow. I couldn't find a picture of William Thow, so I've used a picture of his circular cabside windows, which I think were unique to him. He was a mechanical assistant to Sir John Fowler. He was the engineer responsible for building the standard gauge Metropolitan Railway. So he'd had good experience with Metropolitan 440 tanks. William Thow was appointed as locomotive superintendent of the South Australian Railways about the time that the U-class were delivered. He'd been involved with the, we've said that. He decided to design a new type of locomotive for the South Australian 3-foot 6 railways based on U-class dimensions, but inheriting the leading Bissell truck and inclined cylinders of the Trigby class. So we get the South Australian W class as shown here. First one was delivered in 1878. They were very successful, and a total of 36 were built for South Australia. The Cape Government Railways in South Africa also bought 10, but they didn't persist with them there. I think they needed something bigger. Western Australian Government Railways bought 9. They used them, amongst other things, on mainline passenger trains. They were also used by railway construction contractors in Western Australia. And 6 found their way to Western Australian timber and firewood companies. The sole example of the whole family to work in Victoria was ex-Western Australian Government Railways A-Class number 5, seen here on the Goodwood Tramway, which ran 22 kilometres west of Noojee. The axle load of these was only 5.9 tonnes, which is really very light. I used my standard point of comparison, the Victorian Railways narrow gauge NA class 262 tanks, the famous Puffing Billy type. Their axle loading was about 9.5 tonnes. So comparing 5.9 tonnes, these are very, very light, which they needed to be for the type of bridge work that the Goodwood Tramway provided, which wasn't as good as it should have been. Sorry, I turned over 2 pages there, got lost. So that locomotive had a very hard life at Goodwood. Now we come to the fourth generation, fourth and last generation. In 1884, Tasmanian C class, South Australian Y class, and Western Australian G class. The fourth generation had the same size driving wheels and same rigid wheelbase as the third generation. It had a longer total wheelbase, so the leading axle was a little further from the leading driving axle, and the cylinders, boiler and firebox were larger. The frames were longer front and back to accommodate the bigger cylinders, boiler and firebox. And the maximum axle load was increased from 5.9 tonnes to 7 3/4 tonnes. That was quite a big increase. And the effect of all those changes was to change a good design into a great design, at least for those railways where the conditions suited such a locomotive. Tasmania initially bought one, where it became the C class. They were very happy with it and purchased another 27 in several batches. And all of those came from Beyer Peacock. Tasmanian Government Railways at that time seemed to have been very well run, very well managed, and they bought all their locomotives from Beyer Peacock, which seemed to be a very sound idea. That's the typical Tasmanian stovepipe funnel, and sloping smoke box is still there. South Australia bought 7 of these in 1884, the same time as Tasmania. South Australia had a copper-topped funnels, and they also were very pleased with them. 127 followed in several batches. Of those, 50 came from Beyer Peacock, 81 from James Martin in Adelaide, and 3 from other builders. Western Australian Government Railways bought their first one in 1889, and I think they bought that from a contractor. These locomotives were very popular with railway contractors in Western Australia, who were confident they could sell them after they'd built their railway to the Western Australian Government Railways. And if they weren't interested, they could sell them to firewood or timber tramways. With the Western Australian Government Railways, another 47 followed in several batches. This is not the 1889 one, this is a later one with a somewhat extended smoke box. Of the 47, 7 came from Beyer Peacock, 29 from James Martin in Adelaide, and 12 from Nielsen in the United Kingdom. I think there might have been something faulty with these Nielsen deliveries, because they tended to derail at speed on passenger trains, and speed means in this case, I would think about 35 miles an hour. Since derailments were not a problem in South Australia or Tasmania, that seems to indicate some special fault. But as a result of the fault, Western Australian Government Railways also went for a variant of these with the leading bogie. So we have 4 60G classes and 2 60G classes, which is rather confusing. So this is a summary of those built for state railways in Australia. Tasmania 28, South Australia 134. One of my sources said 1 came from Baldwin. I find that difficult to believe, but I didn't have time to check. And with Western Australia, this is just the 260 version, there were 48. Then we have many other Australian users, railway construction contractors, private railways, the Commonwealth Railways in South Australia and the Northern Territory. They purchased theirs second-hand from other state railways. And there was a very active second-hand market. Many of these locomotives led very interesting lives, and they were complicated lives. Western Australian timber and firewood companies had a total of 45 G-class, purchased beginning 1889. 30 were 260s and 15 were 460s. And they were a mixture of new and second-hand purchases. Western Australian timber companies were very well financed and big operations, much different to those in the eastern states, most of those in the eastern states. Now, there were a number of very interesting or quite interesting variants of the fourth generation. For example, the Silverton Tramway had a 262 tank version delivered in 1890 with an added rear Bissell truck. It was the same dimensions as the South Australian Y class, with the addition of the Bissell truck, water tank and bunker. Apart from this one built for the Silverton Tramway, 2 more were built for other mining companies at Broken Hill, and all of them ended up at Whyalla, South Australia, for BHP. There were 8 similar ones built for the Alcoy and Gandia meter gauge railway in Spain. Once again, this railway ran through difficult mountainous country, and these locomotives seemed to be ideal for that. They were the sole motive power for the railway during its entire life. And this beautiful photograph shows a typical train in the last years of that railway, taken in 1967. The railway was closed in 1969, along with a lot of other meter gauge lines in Spain. And we have a meter gauge Argentinian example of the 262 with an extended smoke box this time. That's quite a late example, 1910. And a 264 tank version for Brazil, meter gauge, with a much bigger bunker. Similar locomotives to this were used on the railway on the Isle of Malta, which was closed in 1930 or thereabouts. And we have a 260 saddle tank version. This one was used on the Ballymena and Larne Railway, 3-foot gauge in Ireland. And a meter gauge version of a 260 tank used for a Spanish mining company. BHP in Australia had at least one 3-foot 6-inch gauge version at Whyalla, and I think that one may have been originally used in New South Wales around Broken Hill. Now, finish up with some more distant relatives. I'm not sure whether these had leading Bissell bogies or a different type of bogie. If they had a different type of bogie, I think they're rather far removed from the family. But in Japan, they had a lot of 440s. And the Tasmanian Government Railways also had 440s, the A and B class. The Western Australians had a T class 440. And South Australia had Z-class 440s, which had similar features. And here's an example for Argentina with ball-sharp valve gear. And even further removed is a Brazilian meter gauge 460 example with wall-sharp valve gear. Was there a fifth generation? No, there wasn't. Not built by Beyer Peacock that I could find. But the South Australian Railways, around about the turn of the 20th century, developed a 480 locomotive called the T-class, which certainly inherited a lot of the Y-class features, the sloping cylinders. It looked like a grower, as built, it looked like a growing up Y-class. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a good photograph of the SAR T-class as built. They lost much of their family appearance with rebuilds. Okay, that's the end of the presentation. I'd like to acknowledge the assistance of Peter Manning with information and photographs, Simon Colbeck, David Fletcher, Mike McCarthy and Peter Lemmy for photographs. And then I've listed my major sources just to show I didn't make it up. Thank you very much.